That is, he refers it to, we would say he refers it to Rome. That is, again, he accepts the traditional religion of the society in which he lived. The Republic is not an examination of religion itself. He merely acknowledges the necessity of it and says that we will leave that to the religious institution, which in his case largely was the religion of the oracle at Delphi, which was the seat of particular authority to Athens. Okay, so those are the four classes. Now, you remember Adeimantus or Glaucon, I forget which of the two brothers, immediately says, gosh, I wouldn't want to live in a state like that. Where are the doctors? Suppose you get sick. The joke comes up immediately, where are the lawyers? And Socrates says, well, you're talking really about an unhealthy state. That is, you don't need doctors, you don't need lawyers when everybody really does his own work.
That is obviously
it's a sign of decadence right away when you need those.
Yeah, yeah. If see any sane person who looked at our society.
Actually, reading the Republic is that you discover that Socrates is opposed to the Socratic method. You hear all over the place today this thing called the Socratic method, which consists of continuously asking questions to try to undermine whatever it is that anybody believes. You're supposed to shake people out of their convictions that they received in an unthinking way from childhood. And Socrates in Book 7 has an attack on doing that. We have, I take it, he says, certain convictions from childhood about the just and the honorable, in which, in obedience and honor to them, we have been bred as children under their parents. And are there not other practices going counter to these that have pleasures attached to them and that flatter and solicit our souls, but do not win over men of any decency? But they continue to hold in honor the teachings of their fathers and obey them? I don't know, that might be a little difficult to hear. The translation there is a bit literary, perhaps not auditory. But what he's saying is quite obvious. We are all brought up from childhood living according to basic principles that our parents have taught us. Principles about everything. That is certainly about manners. That is, you sit in a certain way and hold your knife and fork in a certain way, and don't interrupt your elders when they're talking and that sort of thing. Cough into a handkerchief. But also, it includes morals. You're told that some things are right, some things are wrong. And you're also taught certain things about reality. Don't touch the stove, it'll burn you. Look out for snakes, they're dangerous. That is, you accept certain facts on authority from your elders. And as you grow older, there are all kinds of things that occur to you in your life that fight against what your parents have taught you. There's all kinds of enticements, solicitations, he says, that flatter us. But if we have been well brought up, we don't give in to them. That is, we turn our backs and we say, well, that's very attractive, but my parents told me that I should have nothing to do with that, and you don't. We continue, he says, to hold in honor, despite all these solicitations of the world, those things that our parents taught us. Well then, Socrates says, when a man of this kind is a well brought up young man, is met by the question, what is the honorable? And on his giving the answer which he learned from the lawgiver, the argument confutes him, and by many and various refutations upsets his faith and makes him believe that this thing is no more honorable than it is base. And when he has had the same experience about the just and the good and everything else that he held in esteem, how do you suppose that he will conduct himself thereafter in the matter of respect and obedience to this traditional morality? And his interlocutor, I think it's Glaucon here, says, it is inevitable that he will not continue to honor and obey as before. And then Socrates says, when he ceases to honor these principles and to think that they are binding on him, and yet cannot discover the true principles, will he be likely to adopt any other way of life than that which flatters his desires? See the argument. That is, the sophist who comes in with the so-called Socratic method and by clever arguments undermines what he's been taught in his childhood. The sophist who undermines the student's faith in those principles that he's been given. The sophist doesn't give him anything else. All he does is undermine. That kind of education does nothing but take away what has been held and gives nothing else. It never rises to the discovery of any real principle. And so the student is left without any defense against those enticements and those flatteries, as Socrates calls them, of the world. And he's just going to become an unprincipled, worldly person. And this is the terrible danger of most college education today. That's really what happens to students when they come up to college. They're assailed in every class they take by violent attacks on everything that they've ever believed. They're not converted to anything else. They don't really become anything else, but they become what he calls a misologist in another dialogue. I forget where he uses that word.
It's in the Phaedo, I think.
It's in the Phaedo, that's right. Yeah. Remember, he says, whatever you do, when he's dying, among his last words, he says, whatever you do, don't become one of these people who thinks that there isn't any truth at all. That is, you just think, oh, gosh, you can tear anything to shreds. These arguers are so clever. If you tell them 2 and 2 is 4, in 15 minutes, you don't know whether 2 and 2 is 183. You just end up saying, oh, the heck with ideas. It's hopeless. So Socrates gives us this really a severe warning. He says, such a person will then become a rebel to law and convention. And is this not the experience of those who take up dialectics in this fashion? Without the prerequisites? And he goes on to say that you should not enter into that kind of a study until you're 30 years old. Well, most of us do think that that's excessive. That perhaps it should be 25, I don't know. But it certainly shouldn't be 17 or 18 or 19, or even 15 or 16, which is the way it's done today.
Yeah, well, the dialectic has that D-I-A prefix on it, which has to do with, it's the same as in dialogue, where there are, which means literally two words, and dialectic is really from the same root. It has to do with two things. Oh, there are always two, like as in there always being two sides. That's often the way this is formulated, is that there are two sides to every question. Dialectic is a way of arguing or reasoning about certain kinds of questions where you ask the question, is it this or is it that? It's never an exhaustive kind of question. It may be something else, but you often in conversation, and Socrates sometimes does this. He says, well, is justice this or is it this? Is it one or the other? But in the hands of the sophists, this becomes the only way of discoursing about anything, and all questions are questions of is it this or is it that? Always with the implication that it may be either one, and that you never really are able to satisfactorily reach a conclusion about it. That is that every question and every issue, as they say, has two sides. And there are people on one side and there are people on the other side. And that the only way to become educated is to know both sides. Really, that's what an education becomes, is a knowledge of all sides of all questions, but not ever arriving at any truth about them.
So that's that. There isn't any truth. Plato founded the academy, and the word academic has come to mean just that. It's really ironic. Even in the ancient world, that was true. By the age of St. Augustine, let's say, which is a long time after Plato himself, we're talking about 500 or 600 years, long towards the year 400 AD, whereas with Plato we're talking about 400s BC, so it's a long way on. But by that time, the word academic just meant skeptic. It was a word for skeptic. And today we use that phrase, well, that's just an academic question. And it means it's an ingenious question, you can argue about it, but it has no relation to reality. And I think what the student learns in college is pretty much just that. Sure, you can take sides, you can join a political party, but that doesn't mean that it's true. Well, and if for some reason it's expedient, you can join another one.
Well, that once again, we spent the last lecture talking about politics, and you can see the sophists had a tremendous. They were interested in politics. They were involved in politics. They influenced political thinking in their time very, very greatly. And this is one of the ways in which they influenced it was to say that not only are the affairs of this world matters of taking two sides. That is, there's a democratic approach and a Republican approach, and the Republicans think this and the Democrats think that. That is, and that, of course, when it is applied to practical affairs, is often quite true. That is, you say, well, I don't know whether the candidate for the presidency is necessarily the best man. There are two candidates, let's say, in this country, and you say, well, I don't think very much of either one of them, but I don't know whether one or the other is going to turn out to be a great president. How do I know? I mean, that's a contingency, and you say, well, you do the best you can. You investigate the issues and you consider the worth of the person and listen to what he says, and you try to pick the best man. But you don't say, well, I know that's the best man. You listen to other people, and they say, well, yeah, you have a good point there. This man seems to know a lot about economics, but he doesn't seem to know anything about warfare and so forth and so forth. You are involved in endless debate. Well, the sophists took advantage of that truth, and they worked it backwards. They said, well, all questions are those kinds of questions. That is, all questions are dialectical questions and are subject to this dialectic, and that really the question about justice is this kind of a question. Is there justice? Is there such a thing as justice, or is there not such a thing as justice? Well, that's an academic question. There are people who say there is, and there are people who say there aren't, and there are a lot of arguments on both sides, good arguments on both sides, and your object as one who is being educated is to learn what those arguments are, and that's all. And of course that means that you never do find out what the right thing is. That question becomes irrelevant. What's the right answer? I suppose I have heard more often than any other criticism of the course that we taught here at the university called the Integrated Humanities. I suppose more than any other slogan that was used against us, it was the slogan that we think that we have the truth, or those guys think that they have the truth, and they produce students who think that there is such a thing as the truth. They always put it in quotation marks. There is such a thing as the truth, and they always say this with heavy derision and mockery, because that is really, you can't say that. That is not permitted. You can't say in the university that there is such a thing as the truth.
See, this is the shadow of Alcibiades, again, isn't it? There are two shadows that fall across everything that Plato wrote. One of them is the death of Socrates, and the other one is the success of Alcibiades, the star, the political and military star of the age, who betrayed his country, who went over to the other side in the middle of the war because he wasn't treated right, he thought, by Athens. And so he took his talents elsewhere. It didn't matter to him.
Well, he was
which side he was on.
Military dialectician, as it were. He was on one side, and then he was on the other side, and then he came back.
Had the audacity to come back, and
they
they
took
took
the other side.
He was so good that they took him back. But he was the most brilliant student of Socrates, and all across Plato's writings, you find this shadow falling. That is the danger in philosophy. The danger in the study of philosophy, because it does begin by questioning things. That's true. I mean, it is necessary to ask questions like, what is justice, and what is honor, what is good? But Socrates here is giving us a very fair warning that those questions cannot be raised in a vacuum. They can't be raised without the prerequisites. And those prerequisites are, first of all, a grounding in what he calls in this passage a tradition. The translator even uses the word convention, I think, at one point. He says, such a person will become a rebel to law and convention. That is, we are animals born in families, and we receive a certain way of life from our family. And our families live in tribes, that is, live in nations. And we're not atomic beings who come together by way of the social contract. We talked about this before. Plato insists, Socrates here insists, that we have to look at the way we are in nature, not the way we might be according to some scheme that we make up. The fact of the matter is, we don't pick and choose our beliefs. We're born into a tradition of beliefs. Now, it may be that that tradition has to be refined and criticized, cut back sometimes when it gets overgrown, but Socrates insists here that you can't get anywhere unless you are part of a tradition. You can't kill the tree that you're pruning. It may be necessary to make changes, but they can never be substantial changes. They can't be radical changes. That word radical meaning going back to the roots. You can't cut the whole tree down. And that, of course, is what has happened in the modern world. The revolutionary principle, the radical principle, the principle of let's wipe the whole thing out and start over again. Certainly that came in the Renaissance. You get that sweeping change sentiment in some of the greatest thinkers of the Renaissance, with Descartes, for example, who says, well, let's rethink philosophy, right? Let's just wipe everything out. I'm not going to accept anything that I can't prove. Isn't that the way he puts it? I'm going to submit everything to my test. Well, Socrates here is warning against that. He says, if you do that, you're going to end up a skeptic. You're going to end up with Alcibiades. You're going to end up with no belief at all. So he insists on the necessity of a tradition, of going back to our roots.
Sometimes this is called the traditional philosophy, the philosophy that really begins with Plato as philosophy, because it is founded on a tradition. There underlies Plato's philosophy the understanding that we really do already know the truth, that the human race has already seen the truth about things, but that we do not necessarily understand this truth very well. That is, once again, you go back to Glaucon, who at the beginning of the dialogue says, well, Socrates, I know that what Thrasymachus says is wrong. I know that you always ought to do the good. But he says, I've heard people say that this really does not lead to happiness at all. And he said, I don't believe that. I think that what you say is true. I think that if you do the good, that is the way to happiness. But I must say, he says, I'm puzzled about it. I'm confused. And I want to try to understand this better than I do understand it. That's the beginning of philosophy.
He doesn't know why.
No, he doesn't know why.
He doesn't understand why it's true, but he knows that it's true.
He knows that it is true, yes.
But to begin by saying nothing is true is not a beginning at all.
No.
That makes philosophy impossible. It prevents it.
I suppose someone has said that the whole direction of the Platonic Aristotelian philosophy is the effort to understand the truths that are obvious to everyone. That is, it's been called the philosophy of common sense. I think it's Mortimer Adler who says that I think he's talking about ethics, the ethics of common sense. He says, well, the Aristotelian ethics is just the ethics of common sense, that that it's wrong to lie and it's wrong to steal. Everybody knows that, and everybody's told that. Everyone, when you're a child, your parents say, well, you mustn't lie. It's wrong to lie, and it's wrong to steal. It's wrong to cheat. It's wrong to do the common things, and everyone says that. Everyone in the human race says that because you have to say it. Just as you have to say that the human race comes from a family because that's its nature, so you say, well, you can't have a society where people lie to one another. I heard on the radio the other day, I was listening to the radio, and there was on the news broadcast, they had an in-depth study, they said, by some sociologist who had studied all of the races of the world, and he had discovered that in all of the societies there were people who lied. It was a great discovery. But he also discovered that nobody really thought that lying was respectable.
They never thought it was right.
They never thought it was right. People lie, but everybody agrees in all of these societies that, of course, you can't do that it's wrong to do that. And they said things like, well, you couldn't have a society at all. If lying were condoned, if lying were a principle, well, there'd be no such thing as society. Society wouldn't work at all, just as if stealing or murder were condoned. All of these obvious, we're now talking about it purely but it'd be the same if you used a metaphysical principle. If you said, well, what is really isn't. Things that exist really don't exist. Now, if you said that, and you really attempted to construct a society on the basis of that, well, it wouldn't work. You can't construct a society on a contradiction. And there has never been such a society. It's true those ideas creep in sometimes, and they are always rejected. They are always regarded as subversive to the society and to the human race.
That's another commonplace, that they're always going to be subversive.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And these are commonplaces. And I suppose they're rediscovered every once in a while. Somebody looks around and says, nobody really believes in lying. Isn't that remarkable that nobody? And you say, well, everybody's always known that to be true. But then if you say, now what is lying exactly? You say, well, that's a harder
question. To know that, you have to know what is the truth.
Yeah.
What the definition
what is the truth?
That's not so easy.
Yeah, it turns out now you're beginning to ask philosophical questions. But if you start off by saying that there is no such thing as lying, and we really don't know whether lying is good or bad, well, then you have absolutely no place to begin.
You can't talk at all.
Your conversation.
How could you converse? See, it's impossible. I remember years ago reading, I think it was the very famous anthropologist Malinowski. He was a name to reckon with 30 or 40 years ago. And he was talking about some tribes that he had studied, or someone had studied, where they were in New Guinea or something like that. And it was quite amusing. He was trying to find a society which didn't hold to these commonplace things. And he kept hearing that there were some tribes way up in the jungle somewhere. And finally, he got deep into the jungle, and he heard about these people that they didn't believe in marriage, and they thought that there was no incest barrier. You could marry your mother and things like that. But he said that the tribesmen who told him about this other tribe all laughed, and they said, they're all crazy. He said, of course, they're way up in the hills, and they can't get along with anybody else. So that there may be, you always hear about this tribe somewhere in the world that does believe in lying, you see. Well, Malinowski finally found the tribe that did believe in incest or something like that. But that all the other tribes were completely certain that they were outlaws. That is, it was an outlawed tribe. And of course, it merely proves the rule. Well, when I first went up to college, I remember taking an introduction to philosophy, and I guess I was 17 years old, and the professor, who was a very amiable and intelligent, well-educated man, I would say in general, you would think of him as a good teacher. Certainly his classes were interesting and alive, and he did what he wanted to do. He wanted to get the students to think. But on the very first day of class, he assigned some of the dialogues of Bishop Berkeley, the purport of which was to utterly stagger you. The question was, how can you believe your senses? I mean, if you see that tree out there, how do you know it's out there? How can you prove it's out there? Well, I'll go touch it. But how do you know that your touch is telling you anything? And by the time you get through with that hour, by the time we were through, that first hour, we walked out of there absolutely staggered. We didn't believe anything. And that was an introduction to philosophy. And I think that's typical. After that, we went on to Zeno's paradoxes. Just one thing after another to stagger you. And the excuse is always, well, it gets you to think. Well, it doesn't really get you to think. It gets you to substitute a kind of verbal play. Mr. Quinn and I were just talking about this apropos of something else half an hour ago. What a devastating this thing is in the modern world. The substitution of the play of argument without any principles, without any foundation in either fact or in principles of reason. What you do is you argue on the basis of what is a kind of perversion of the Socratic dialectic. Arguing from nothing Nothing received, nothing given. And of course, you can get very clever at that. People get so ingenious, they can spin out theories about everything under the sun. And they become systems, and you have philosophical systems. How do you choose among them? Oh, same way you choose ice cream, I guess, isn't it? Becomes a matter of taste. I know people, the followers of the famous American philosopher, well, I guess he was Spanish originally, but George Santayana, who taught at Harvard, and a very engaging man, a marvelous writer, and a very thoughtful man. I don't want to disparage George Santayana altogether, but I must say, if you follow his way of things, your choice is a matter of aesthetics. It's a matter of the beauty. Oh, I think this Plato is such a beautiful thinker. I'm just thrilled when I read him, because he presents to me a world picture. But of course, then on the other hand, you could take Bishop Berkeley, and that would be perhaps not as good, but on the other hand, it has its view. Just the way you collect pictures. If you were rich enough to buy the masterpieces, you could live with different masters. There's no real fight between Rembrandt and Michelangelo. You could love them both. They paint in different ways.
Well, that's, I suppose we'd say that one of the characteristics of philosophy in our time, and it's also characteristic of art in our time, is what is called eclecticism. I heard someone again on the radio, and this is the sort of thing you just hear all the time, someone who was talking about, I think, ballet, and they were talking about their repertoire, some new company, and they said, well, we have a little bit of everything. You know, we do classical ballet, and we do modern dance, and we do impressionistic dancing. We do everything, because really that's what the public wants. The public likes a variety of things, and we don't think that modern dance is inferior to classical ballet at all. We like both of them, and you hear that all the time. People in any level, people who like jazz, they'll say, well, I like the progressive jazz. I like the old style jazz, New Orleans jazz, and I like the very latest thing. It's sort of a modern adaptation of jazz. I like all kinds. This is eclecticism. Just means a refusal to choose. That's what we elect certain things. We elect a president. That means we choose this one rather than that one. But eclecticism is non-choosing, because we say, well, after all, my taste is no better than anyone else's. Who am I to say? And then we say that about everything. Well, we were interrupted. There's been a hiatus here of about an hour. The doorbell rang, and one of our old friends came in, and we talked to him for about an hour. So we've completely lost the thread of our discourse. I know we've been talking about the dangers of dialectic.
We've been talking about the dangers of dialectic and about in a way, the order of learning again. That is how dangerous it is to try to introduce an advanced subject to someone who hasn't been prepared. And then this got us onto the whole subject of sophistry and of the misuse of dialectic, an abuse of it. That is, that it becomes really, I remember I had brought up that idea of verbal play, that it really becomes nothing more than talk, and we were talking about that.
Yeah.
What we were looking for was a transition, however, to the next large subject that we're going to talk about, and maybe we just better do that.
Yeah, well...
Now the dogs are barking, so we'll be interrupted again. Somebody is trying to stop us from getting on to this next topic. That is, You remember that what we've been talking about is the long digression on education that takes up the whole central part of Plato's dialogue, the Republic. Books 5, 6, and 7, all really off the main point, which is the state. Remember, Socrates had said that the state is the soul writ large, and if you want to understand justice, the easiest way to see it is to talk about the state. But in order to talk about who should be the ideal ruler of the state, he got into the whole subject of education and what kind of preparation such a ruler should have.
One of the principles that is laid down early on in the dialogue is that in order to have a well-run or a just state, you have to have everyone doing their own job. Everyone has to do their own work. And he describes the various people that you have to have in a society. You have to have farmers. Obviously, the society. This is the way Socrates always works. He says, "Well, what is absolutely necessary for this society?" And he says, "You have to have farmers, and you have to have craftsmen, and you have to have soldiers, and you have to have guardians, rulers, and you have to have priests." And the guardians are the ones who really do govern the state. But then he has to explain how these guardians are to be educated. It's essential that they really do know and understand the truth. These are not people who simply accept what has been handed on. You would say that everyone else in the state, the craftsmen and the farmers who make up the vast majority of the population, are people who know the truth because it is nurtured within the society. They learn the truth from what they do and from what has been handed on to them by tradition.
The meaning of the word tradition.
Yes, it just means handed on. Literally, it's like the word trade. Trade, when you hand something over, the word trade literally means hand. And a tradition is something that's handed on. And everyone in the state knows those things, knows the truths of justice through tradition. And they do the just thing. But the rulers have to understand what these things are.
There's an analogy that Socrates makes between the carpenter and the architect. The carpenter knows what he knows and he builds. But the architect has to know why. He has to understand the principles of building. He can't just follow the rules of thumb because the architect designs the house in the first place and has to build for different situations and different times and different places. And so it is with the governor, so it is with the ruler. He has to face new situations and has to make changes and adjustments and so forth.
Well, and this ruler, the philosopher king, we talked last time about the philosopher king, this represents the best kind of state, and also it represents the best kind of soul. There's an analogy, of course, here between a true analogy here between the just state and the just soul.
That is, when everybody does his work.
When everybody is doing his work, in the human soul, when the body is governed by the mind justly, when the mind is working properly, and it governs the body, it governs the emotion, and governs the will, then you have a man who is behaving justly, who has justice in his soul. And when you have a state of this kind where the ruler is a genuinely wise man, in other words, or a lover of wisdom, a philosopher, then you have justice in the state. This is what he calls the aristocracy. This is the best kind of government and the highest form of government. And the word that he uses for it is the Greek word, rule by aristocrat means rule by the the one who has arete, which is something like virtue. It's a hard word to exactly define.
It's connected again with that idea of being first.
First, yes, it has to do with the principles
with
of
the
things.
principles of things.
Someone who has hold. He is the principle of the state, and he has hold of the principles of justice, and therefore he is the one rightfully who should govern. The aristocrat. It has that word has come to mean something that has nothing whatever to do with the original meaning. And so,
you mean the modern use of the word
modern
aristocrat?
use of the word aristocrat?
I mean a snob or something like that.
Someone who is decadent, really. We think aristocrats as being decadent, kind of people who know nothing and who do nothing. It's almost the opposite of what the aristocrat originally was. And of course, you do get that kind of degeneration sometimes in genuine aristocracies. But what it means in Greek, krat, of course, just has to do with rule. And aristo, it does have to do originally with that idea of principle, or the very first thing, or first things.
Think through, those words. That's one of the things that the philosopher does. He examines his terms, which doesn't mean look them up in dictionaries and get too quickly to definitions, but rather just to look at the words themselves and to consider how they're actually used, what their roots are. As if you take them apart or look at the languages from which they come, you can see meanings in them. This whole view of justice goes back down to that word work. Socrates says that justice prevails in a society when everybody minds his own work, not business, but minds his own work. That is, when everybody knows his job and does it. And he comes at that word work very early on in the Republic, actually, when the whole question of justice first comes up. He asks, well, if you want to know whether something is any good or not, you really have to ask, you have to measure the goodness of something by what it is that it's supposed to do. It's very hard to know in some cases what the good of something is. So let's take easy cases. Let's start with easy cases. Now he says, for example, let's take the eye. What makes a good eye as opposed to a bad eye? When you go to the doctors to get glasses, how does he judge? Well, when you can see, we call it 20/20 vision. But when the eye can see, it's good. And insofar as it can't, it's bad. That is, the eye has a work to do. And the work of the eye is to see. The work of the heart is to pump. The work of the sense, your senses is to feel. The work of the ear is to hear. That is, we can see that if he has a good ear, that means he has an ear that hears well. Now, you generalize that idea of work, then. Everything has a work. And if you want to determine whether anything is good or not, you first have to find out what its work is.
Well, this is essentially what they're trying to do in the whole dialogue. They're asking, what is justice? Another way of putting that is, well, what is the work of justice?
What is the work of a man? We know what the work of an eye is. We know what the work of an ear is. But put the whole thing together, what is the work that a man has to do?
What do you have? What do you have when you have a just man? I mean, we're not talking about justice really in the abstract. We're talking about justice in human beings. When does a man have a just soul?
Well, his work.
When he does his work, and when, or not just the soul, but the whole human being. We say a man is healthy when his body works properly, and when all of the parts of the body are doing their work if the eye is deficient, then there's some sort of defect in health. If the ear is deficient, then there's a defect in health. If the heart is deficient, then the whole body does not work properly. A healthy body would be one where all the parts of the body are doing the work that they are made to do. And you have disorder, of course, when you try when these roles become confused.
And we see in society, the question we first ask then is, well, what work has to be done? Now, one of the signs of ill health is not only a malfunction, but unnecessary function, doing things that don't have to be done. If you eat too much and you get fat and you have more fat than you need, you say, well, that's not a condition of health. There is something minimal about work. That is, work has to do with just the right amount of whatever it is that is to be done. And the first thing that Socrates does when he looks at society, when he looks at the soul writ large, is he raises that question: what is the necessary work? And he comes up really with farmers and craftsmen and soldiers, and the priesthood, which he says will not. He doesn't talk very much about that. He says let Delphi take care of that.